And joining me now is Robert Gibbs, NBC political analyst and former press secretary for President Obama, Spencer Ackerman, U.S. national security editor for The Guardian newspaper, and Julian Sanchez, a fellow at the Cato Institute. Thank you all for being here tonight. And Robert, I actually wanted to begin here with you. One of the fascinating things about the press conference to me was the certainty President Obama had that these were necessary programs. And you think back to the campaign and the sort of the aggressive civil liberty rhetoric you heard back then. What happens to an administration? What changes, if anything, has changed when you come in, you begin getting those briefings? Do you think there's been a change in the way the Obama administration treats civil liberties?
I don't think there's been a change in the way they treat civil liberties. I think what you saw here today was what I've heard then Senator Barack Obama and a candidate in 2004 running for the U.S. Senate say we needed somebody watching the watchers. So I don't think there's been a change in civil liberties. I think obviously when you're the commander-in-chief and when you get a sense and see all of what goes into these programs and all of what they uncover in terms of terrorism leads, it presents a picture that you don't normally or wouldn't normally get unless you're intimately involved in the running of the program. So I think obviously your view becomes more nuanced as you become more informed about exactly what threads are out there, what threads you can pull, and where they lead to potential terrorism suspects.
Spencer, you've been at The Guardian quite intimately involved with the Edward Snowden leak, with the reporting on it, with the divulging of this information. Do you think, as a longtime national security reporter, that we would be having this debate, we would have this information if not for Snowden?
Absolutely not. I mean, the evidence of that is that we didn't. It's not just administration officials like Jim Clapper lying to Congress, but it's also just the absolute silence about this throughout the entire administration. To make a quick point, something you didn't hear about in Obama's press conference at all, and you didn't get from any of the documents released today, is a recognition that the deputy director of the National Security Agency testified to last month, which is that in not one case can the National Security Agency say definitively that the bulk phone records collection program that they've put on all of our phone records has stopped, has made the difference to a single terrorism case.
That's kind of there was a release about a Somalian terrorist incident, right, that seemed relatively small, they claimed as a big success for the NSA, but you don't think that actually qualifies?
Well, when the deputy director of the NSA testifies that there are some ways that you should understand the program that isn't necessarily related to its efficacy in stopping a terrorist plot, but helps with analysis of other stuff, it really does raise the question in a lot of people's minds about how necessary this bulk collection really is, and that's an issue you haven't seen the president address. It's an issue that a lot of people in Congress are very concerned about.
Julian, on the question of how the information got divulged, you've had an enormous growth in the U.S. security state since 2001. The amount of new efforts, both technological and legal, that they have, the new capabilities are tremendous. Are folks like Snowden a necessary check on that? Because without that, you're essentially hoping for the government to be significantly or sufficiently forthcoming to actually create enough checks and balances to make sure there are no abuses going on.
No, I think that's right. In much the same way as we recognize that the press stands outside the government, but in some sense is an integral part of a functioning democracy, the same can be said about whistleblowers. I mean, Jefferson famously said he'd rather have, they're forced to choose, he'd rather have a press without government than government without press. Whistleblowers in the same way almost necessarily are outside the formal channels, but are in a way a check and a guarantee that's absolutely essential. So just in the same way that the leak of the Pentagon Papers was a necessary factor in turning public opinion against the Vietnam War, that certainly would never have happened through internal channels. I think the debate we're having now and the fact that the public reaction to it has forced this move shows that this doesn't happen when the secret keepers, determine what is in the interest of national security for the public to know about.
Robert, isn't there a tension with in President Obama arguing this is a debate that the White House welcomes, that it believes it's important, that the civil libertarians and the members of the intelligence community are patriots, and at the same time being furious and saying Snowden, who helped kick much of it off and release much of this information, isn't a patriot?
I don't think there's an inherent tension. I mean, look, I agree with what's been said here. we would clearly not be having nearly as vociferous a debate, nearly as detailed a set of procedures and policies that came out today were it not for this. But let's still be clear. Leaking this type of information is illegal, right? When you gain a clearance to have access to this type of information, they take you into a room, and all the pictures on the room are not of presidents and secretaries of states, they're of convicted spies, okay? You know the rules, right? My office, the press secretary's office, because it's a publicly trafficked office, and I had access to top secret and some compartmentalization above that, has a safe in the office. When I'm done reading that stuff, if I don't want it burned in the Situation Room, it goes into that safe. It gets logged in that I've put it in. So I think there's no doubt we are having this debate because of that. Let's also be clear that regardless, Edward Snowden broke laws that he swore to uphold. And look, I do think this is a very important debate, and I think, quite frankly, what you saw today is really kind of the opening bid, right? We saw the amendment to defund the entire set of programs fail just narrowly in the House. And I think that was sort of an indication to everybody that this was a way, way bigger debate that we were about to have, and I think that will occupy a significant amount of Congress's time in the fall than we had thought probably a week or two before. And the polling clearly shows that even as people want to be safe from terrorism, there are concerns about privacy. So I think this is the beginning of, I think, what's going to occupy a lot of administration time.
I want to talk about that next bid right when we get back.
It's true, we have significant capabilities. What's also true is we show a restraint that many governments around the world don't even think to do, refuse to show. And that includes, by the way, some of America's most vocal critics. So we shouldn't forget the difference between the ability of our government to collect information online under strict guidelines and for narrow purposes, and the willingness of some other governments to throw their own citizens in prison for what they say online.
That was the president making an argument you'll hear from a lot of defenders of the NSA surveillance, that just because U.S. can spy on Americans, it doesn't mean they do. Or so doesn't mean they do without check. Still with me are Robert Gibbs, former press secretary for President Obama, Spencer Ackerman from the Guardian newspaper, and Julian Sanchez from the Cato Institute. And Spencer, you had a big news break today with details of an NSA loophole that can be used to initiate much wider searches than people previously recognized were possible. Walk me through that a little bit.
This is something that Senator Wyden has very, very obliquely sort of hinted at for about a year exists. He calls it the backdoor search loophole. To get a very complicated story narrowed down really, really distinctly. Let's see if I can beat the clock on this. There's something called the 702 provision in a 2008 bill, and that basically says it allows foreign communications believed to be from foreigners related to espionage, related to terrorism, to be collected, not just the data about them, but the conversations themselves. Now, inside that data, there's some subject, because you're talking about such a huge pool, and because of some technological necessities, there are some Americans' communications that are swept up in that as well. And you've heard Obama say, both today and previously, well, we don't listen to Americans' communications. We're not listening to your phone calls. We're not reading your emails. Well, some of that data is inside this so-called 702 series of databases. And this loophole that we disclosed today, that we sort of gave the evidence that Senator Wyden's been sort of nodding about and sort of indicating about, shows that under certain conditions, starting in 2011, the NSA was given the authority to search for U.S. person identifiers. They're actually querying that database to find perhaps Ezra Klein, to find Julian Sanchez, to find Robert Gibbs, and so on and so forth within that database. And this is something completely different from the way the administration, even over these last 8 weeks, has talked about their authorities.
And on those authorities, Julian, one thing that the administration did today was release a brief looking at the legal reasoning behind the NSA surveillance programs. You've read through it. Were you comforted by it? Did you think it made a clear case for why they have this authority and why it needs to be used?
No, it reads like someone got high and mixed up a Deepak Chopra book with their criminal procedure manual. It's a complete mess.
So you didn't like it?
I was not that impressed.
So you didn't write it?
Well, no. Yeah, I mean, so on a bunch of levels, it's a mishmash of kind of weird attempts to cite disanalogous cases from civil procedure or administrative, investigations. Legally, it's an incredible mess, and it tries to make this really implausible argument. One, that this whole database can be relevant to, and the language in the statute is, you need stuff that's relevant to an investigation. And they try and sort of say, well, all of it's relevant to an investigative process that can be used in different future investigations at some point, and that may be true, but it's not what the law says. And they also, I mean, this is on a slightly technical point, take something that's really clearly supposed to be a historical records order, for stuff that already exists, and argue that it can be used to kind of create an ongoing obligation to hand over records over time. Everything else about electronic surveillance law on the intelligence side and on the criminal side makes no sense on that reading. So it's just a weird pastiche of stuff to try and justify something that that I think nobody believed was possible 10 years ago when they passed this law.
There's also a kind of subtle redefinition of what surveillance means that's lurking sort of between the lines here that you've heard from the NSA in recent weeks, and that's, when does the surveillance occur? Does it occur when they take your data, or does it occur when they look through your data? They've started to argue, the administration has, and you've heard this somewhat from Obama today, sort of between the lines, that it only happens when they query the stuff they've already taken, and they have safeguards on that, and it's limited. The problem with that is, and this is going to be part of the debate going forward, is that the Patriot Act that they're deriving this authority from isn't about when you can analyze data, it's about when you can collect it.
And Robert, when you hear this debate, and you've been in these briefings and you know why the administration believes these things are necessary, do you think, well, the folks out here just don't understand? They don't understand what we're up against. They don't understand the danger. They don't understand the responsibility. Do you think this is a debate that is simply asymmetrical and people can't see why it's necessary? Or is this actually a debate that is being had fairly?
Yes. I think this is a debate that is important to have. I think this is a debate where some transparency is necessary to give people confidence about how these programs are conducted, to give people confidence that just because Verizon or AT&T gives bulk data collection to somebody, and I think there'll be a debate on who will hold that information in the fall, but just because they give that information and might use it later to track a cell phone call once we know a suspect in Yemen or Somalia or something like that, that isn't used in a way that is ultimately nefarious, or that we're listening to every one of these conversations. I listen to some of these debates and I wonder, if you listen to these, you would think we must have 1 million people working for the FBI, because we're listening to 310 billion or million people's phone conversations. Now, if you make 10 calls a day and everybody makes 10 calls a day, you'd have to employ hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people to listen to all these. And we need to have a debate that shows people, here's what we're doing and here's what we're not doing, and how it's conducted in a way that makes people safer. Because regardless of where you stand on this debate, we have clearly gotten information based on cell phone records and calls and picked up clues on events that didn't happen because we stopped those events.
This is really totally disingenuous, right? Yes, phone records can be useful sometimes, which is why you have traditionally a targeted authority once you have a particular contact, a particular number that you think is associated with the terrorist, to get that person's phone records and maybe their associates' phone records. There was legislation Obama very strongly supported in 2005 that would have said that's the limit. A suspected terrorist or spy and their associates 1 hop away, not 3 hops away, pulling in tens of thousands of people who have nothing to do with anything and are then in a secondary database you can do backdoor searches of. None of the cases they've discussed, which, by the way, often seem to involve funding, not plots. One case they tried to say was a plot. Turned out the prosecutors who actually were involved in that case said, actually, no, there was no specific plot. This was another material support funding case, not a plot case. But there's never been any intelligible case made that they need a bulk database like this in any of the cases they've talked about. In every one of these cases, it would have been sufficient to get a more targeted search. And this is a pattern we've seen again and again with warrantless wiretapping, with fusion centers, saving lives, absolutely necessary. And then a couple of years later, when the inspector generals or the Senate do a real inquiry with access to the classified information, oops, it turns out fusion centers never produced any useful information. Oops, it turns out warrantless wiretapping was of incredibly limited utility. It wasn't pivotal in the cases they said it was. You know, you have to wonder whether they're overselling.
Well, let's be clear, Ezra. AT&T and Verizon, they don't keep your records, right? So if you want to find...
For 2 years.
If you want to find somebody and go backwards several years, how are you going to do that? You can't... You have to have...
But if you want to listen to the conversation from 2 years ago...
You have to have some and you can't listen to a conversation in the past. You have to have some collectible data with which to trace those numbers. And here's why we need to have this debate, because you just slammed together warrantless wiretapping and 7 other things. There isn't warrantless wiretapping, right? You've got to go to a FISA court. You've got to go... You have to have now. You have to have a warrant for that.
So 702 surveillance is still warrantless wiretapping.
But let's have a debate on what is happening, what is accurate. This notion, again, somehow that hundreds of thousands of people are listening to hundreds of millions of phone calls every day, it's simply not happening.
Spencer, I want to let you get in here.
Yeah, to some degree, you're arguing against a meme here, aren't you, Robert, rather than arguing with what Julian is saying. But the point that I think is probably important to make is you heard President Obama say abuses haven't occurred. Well, there are lots of people who believe that the abuse is the simple fact that the government is collecting all of this stuff in the first place without an individualized suspicion of wrongdoing. And then on the question of, you know, Verizon, AT&T, they don't hold the data for a sufficient amount of time for terrorism investigations to look on back, you know, several years, which is an important point to raise. Well, why not have had a debate several years ago when the Obama administration realized that was the issue, and then go to Congress and say, we need some legislation to compel the telecoms to do that, to compel ISPs and so forth to do that. That didn't happen. This occurred entirely in secret. This occurred while the Obama administration was either not talking about it, or intelligence officials were sort of reassuring Congress, particularly those who didn't have access to the intelligence, who weren't on the intelligence committees, that it wasn't happening at all, or giving very, very limited and decontextualized reasons to believe that it was. So when you want to say you have a debate, I mean, this is something of a test of the administration's seriousness.
Well, look, I think in many ways, I agree with the last part. We are having this debate because of what is out there, and we now should have that debate about what makes sense to collect, when it makes sense to collect it, and again, how we're going to watch those that collect that data and make sure it's used in reasonable ways. I think having this debate, again, whether or not it is either ill-timed or should have been done 2 years ago, there's a lot of things we wish could have happened 2 years ago. I would love to have won Powerball 2 years ago. But I think we're having that debate now, and I think it's, look, I think it's an important debate. Again, I think it's going to dominate a lot of what happens, and I think this is really just the beginning, what happened today, of what is going to happen in Congress. When the president says, let's redo Section 215, that's, you know, that's sort of that's a big deal. That's going to involve a lot of different scenarios and policies, and I think that could be a pretty broad debate.
And I think what matters in terms of that is that when they begin to open up Section 215, which is a part of the Patriot Act that permits this, or the Obama administration argues permits it, that actually does create the space to open up the bill, and you have that debate now in Congress, to exactly your point, Spencer. If there is now a mechanism, there's a sort of legislative vehicle that has been agreed upon by everybody that will be, it seems, the vehicle for this debate going forward. Robert Gibbs, Spencer Ackerman, Julian Sanchez, thank you all for being here tonight. It was good to have part of the debate here on the show.